I won't need to do much elaborating on the attributes and virtues of our speaker this evening. I would like to make a couple of observations about him. We were visiting earlier about the problems of ego and success. And as we were discussing and criticizing others for their frailties, we discussed that some political figures, some actors, some union leaders, some athletes, some sports stars, newscasters, columnists, and radio announcers, what have you, have been known to be afflicted with an ego problem. Seriously, I was taken with the fact that Ronald Reagan has been all of these things and most successful in every one. Politically, I think he astounded a lot of people when he succeeded to the office of the governorship of California. Even more so, he astounded people that he did a very creditable job, a great job as the chief executive of that state, which, were it a world economic power, would be the 7th ranking in the world. And I think possibly one of the ingredients that's most fundamental in the guy is the fact that he has maintained a common touch. And perhaps the reason for that is that rather quietly and unobtrusively, before it became more commonplace politically, this was a very faithful Christian. I ran across something, or in fact it was given to me today by a friend, that was commented in Christian Life about Governor Reagan when he was taking his oath of office in California. He said this: "All through my life I've received comfort and help from God when I've asked for it. I guess the two things I ask for most in my prayers are wisdom and strength." When he stood in the rotunda of the Capitol in Sacramento for the oath of office during the first minutes of 1967, he surprised the assembled guests and the television audience by declaring his intentions to conduct his office according to the teachings of Jesus Christ and to seek God's help in the discharge of his duties. I suspect maybe this is the key to his humility, and the fact that he's managed to maintain a perspective, become kind of a keeper of the faith, an observer, someone who speaks for a lot of the views held by many of us on the national and world scene. I think it's particularly apropos that he returns again to Houston Baptist College to honor us and speak, I hope tonight, on the issues of why Houston Baptist College, as a Christian school committed to the teachings of Christ, not seeking federal aid, nor has it accepted any, has been as incredibly successful as it has been. And it's a pleasure again to introduce him. I think as long as there's a hope that I can bring him back every few years, I'll probably be life program chairman. But anyway, it is a real pleasure to introduce Governor Reagan.
Thank you very much. Thank you. Well, Jim Lyons, I thank you very much for that introduction. There was one thing, though, I don't know. We were sitting here just a few minutes ago before he got up, and he whispered to me, "Were you a good football player?" Dr. Hinton, Reverend clergy, the members and officers of the President's Council, the Advisory Board, the administrators, faculty, students of Houston Baptist University, and you, the friends of this university. You know, I always feel a little bit strange at a gathering such as this, because there is inherent in this, and of course, with the beginnings of this university and how it has prospered, the knowledge of people who went out and who raised resources to make this happen. Now, the reason I feel self-conscious, I've never been able to do that very well. I think that's why I got into public office. There, you don't have to ask for money, you just take it. But you know, there was a man in a small town who became the chairman one year of the annual charitable drive in that town. And after looking at all the records, he went to one of the leading citizens and he said, "Our records show that your earnings are $90,000 a year, and yet you have never contributed to the town charity." And the man said, "That's right." And he said, "Do your records also show that my widowed sister with 4 children was left destitute? My mother has no means of support. My older brother was wounded in the war and has been totally disabled since." And kind of abashed, the chairman said, "Well, no, our records don't show that." Well, he said, "I don't give anything to them. Why should I give something to you?" Do you know, in this wonderful free enterprise world of ours, we've all learned that if you get up earlier than your neighbor, if you work harder and scheme more and stick to the job and stay later planning how to do better, you'll leave a lot more money when you die, and you'll leave it sooner. There's a need today to communicate, and communication takes more than just a willing speaker and a willing listener. The thing that has happened here, for example, should be known far wider to encourage others in this day of how successful an institution of this kind can be. Now, when I talk about communicating, I have to tell you that the best description of proper communication that I've ever heard was given to me by a sports announcer, a fellow named Danny Villanueva. He formerly place-kicked for the Los Angeles Rams and later, forgive the expression, the Dallas Cowboys. But he was having dinner one night after he became a sports announcer over at the home of a young ball player with the Los Angeles Dodgers. They were talking sports. The young wife was bustling about getting the dinner ready, and the baby started to cry. And over her shoulder she said to her husband, "Change the baby." And he was embarrassed in front of Danny, and he turned and he says, "What do you mean, change the baby?" He said, "I'm a ball player. That's not my line of work." And she turned around, put her hands on her hips, and she communicated. She said, "Look, Buster, you lay the diaper out like a diamond, you put second base on home plate, put the baby's bottom on the pitcher's mound, hook up first and third, slide home underneath, and if it starts to rain, the game ain't called, you start all over again." But in the election campaign just passed, there was much talk of America's place in the world, of the erosion of time-tested moral standards, and of the seeming inability of an economic system which has produced more for more people to now solve the problems of unemployment and inflation. And always these issues were discussed in the context of what did government intend to do about them. May I suggest that just possibly government has already done too much about them. Indeed, government, by going beyond and outside its proper province, has caused many, if not most, of the problems that vex us. Now, some of us are old enough to remember when the only contact you seemed to have with the federal government was now and then to go down to the post office and buy a stamp. They were 2 cents each for twice-a-day delivery. Now they're 13 cents for once-a-day delivery to the wrong address. My friend Senator Dewey Bartlett of Oklahoma says that last 3 cents on the price is for storage. And he says that we could improve the service if we paid the postal employees by mail. But how much are we, the citizens, to blame for what has happened? Starting with the traumatic experience of the Great Depression, we've turned more and more to government for answers that government has neither the right nor the capacity to provide. But because government always seeks to increase itself in size and power, government has attempted to provide those answers. And the result is a fourth branch of enormous power added to our traditional 3 of executive, legislative, and judicial. A vast federal bureaucracy now being imitated in too many states, too many cities. The bureaucracy is permanent. It determines policy to a greater extent than any of us could realize, and it can't be removed from office by our votes. A friend of mine recently was visiting his congressman. He told me they were sitting in the office when the congressman looked at his watch and said, "Oh, I have to go." And he explained that he had to go over and see the director of one of the large agencies in Washington. My friend said, "But you're the congressman. He works for you." Why doesn't he come here to see you? And believe it or not, the congressman said maybe 15 or 20 years ago, but now when they call, we go. Now, I don't know whether this frightens you as it does me, that our elected representatives can be more beholden or more intimidated by the permanent structure of government than they are by the constituency back home. And of course, we bear a greater tax burden to support that permanent structure than any of us would have ever dreamed possible only a few decades ago. In fact, in 1930, governments, federal, state, and local, were only taking a dime out of each dollar earned, and a third of that financed the federal establishment. Today, the governments are taking 44 cents out of every dollar earned, and 2/3 of that goes to Washington. The cost of government is the biggest single expense item in the average family budget. It is greater than food, shelter, and clothing, all put together. And it's the fastest growing cost item in our daily living, but curiously, it is not one of the factors used in computing the cost of living index, possibly because those in government have exempted themselves from feeling any of the pain of inflation by virtue of an automatic cost of living pay raise for all time to come. Did you ever get the thought sometimes that government is like a baby? It's an alimentary canal with an appetite at one end and no sense of responsibility at the other. There are 70 million Americans working and earning in the private sector to support themselves and their dependents. They also support 81 million other Americans who are totally dependent on tax dollars for their year-round living. It's true about 15 million of those are public employees who also pay taxes. But their taxes are simply a return to government of tax dollars that first had to be taken from those 70 million. I say this to emphasize that 70 million people in this country are government's total resource. It has no other source of revenue. Political demagogues, aided by spokesmen for a variety of causes, some worthy in themselves, but questionable as to whether they're the proper concern of government, have created a political and economic mythology that's widely believed by the American people. And this has made possible an increase in government's ability to interfere in the free marketplace. Profit has become a dirty word blamed for most of our social ills. In the interest of something called consumerism, free enterprise is becoming far less than free. Property rights are being reduced and even eliminated in the name of environmental protection. And you wonder where and when will our voices be raised pointing out that profit, property, and freedom are inseparable, and you can't have the third unless you're entitled to the first two. And yet, even the most critical of us fall prey to the habit of when something goes wrong, our first reaction is there ought to be a law. Sometimes I think there ought to be a law against saying there ought to be a law. You know, the German statesman Bismarck said, if you like sausages and laws, you should never watch either one of them being made. But it's difficult to understand the ever-increasing number of intellectuals in the groves of academia, present company excepted, who say that the system could be improved if we would adopt some, if not all, of the principles of socialism. Now, you can't say these eminent scholars are ignorant. It's just that they know a great many things that aren't true. In Arizona in 1972, the Arizona Superintendent of Education sought to install a course on free enterprise in the Arizona high schools, and it would be a requirement for a high school diploma. And he said that surveys had revealed that the majority of young people had apparently been taught that socialism was preferable to capitalism. He sought help in creating such a course. He went to the 3 campuses of the State University of Arizona. Only 2 economic professors out of 40 expressed enough belief in free enterprise to offer him any help. Now, the production of necessities, if socialism is all that it's held up to be, such as food in our country, in any other area of comparison between our system and socialism, the superiority of the free marketplace and the miracles of which it is capable have been proven over the godless tyranny of statism spawned by the idiocy of Karl Marx. Even so, we're covered with a network of regulations that control virtually every facet of our lives. If some of us let our minds go back to our own childhood in this land, we can see and remember how much freedom has been lost for all of us. There are 75,000 federal regulators and inspectors enforcing tens of thousands of regulations, with about 25,000 new ones added each year. There is one you probably haven't heard of, this agency. It's relatively new, only a few years old, the Occupational Safety and Health Administration. Oh, you have heard of it. This is an agency that now has more than 4,000 regulations. They went into one industrial plant and made them tear out and replace all of the guardrails that were 41 and 43 inches high, because their regulation now says they must be 42 inches high. In another installation, they made them shorten the wheelbase on all of the forklift trucks so they'd turn shorter as a safety factor. Now they turn shorter and they tip over. But the farmers of America, I think, were the most enraged with the treatment they received. They got a handsome, slick paper booklet on the hazards of farm life. And among the hazards listed was one that said, when walking about the farm, you should keep your eyes on the ground, because here and there might be a slippery substance which, if you stepped in it, could cause a nasty fall. Now, you know no farmer would have thought of that by himself. But paperwork for the FTC, it's demanding data that the SEC already has, and the BLS is asking for reports that some subjects that are already covered by the FTC, and the FDA requires paperwork that adds 50 cents now to the cost of every prescription that is written. One druggist has told me that it takes him more time to fill out the paper every time he makes a prescription than it does to make the prescription. The president of the Eli Lilly Drug Company says his company spends more man-hours on required government paperwork than on cancer and heart research combined. Independent businessmen and women, many of you, send paperwork to Washington that adds $50 billion a year to the cost of doing business, and then $20 billion is added on for taxes to pay for government share in shuffling that paper. We've become so used to talking in terms of billions. Does anyone really know what a billion is? 1 billion minutes ago, Christ was walking on this earth. 1 billion hours ago, our ancestors lived in caves, and it's questionable as to whether they discovered the use of fire as yet. $1 billion ago was yesterday in Washington, D.C., and $1 billion today, and $1 billion tomorrow, and if the new budget is passed as it's been introduced, it'll be $1.5 billion today and $1.5 billion tomorrow. Bring it closer to home. If you gentlemen sent your wives out on a shopping spree and gave them each $1 billion and told them not to spend no more than $1,000 a day, they won't be home for 3,000 years. And what has been done to education? Well, HEW has told the University of Seattle Faculty Wives Association that it must disband unless it admits men. In Des Moines, Iowa, Roosevelt High School Dad and Daughter Valentine Day Dinner has been canceled because it violates the sex discrimination guidelines. And for the same reason, the Wethersfield, Connecticut 6th grade boys choir has been disbanded because they say that musical groups can only be divided on a basis of vocal range. And in 6th grade, the boys still sing soprano. Not too long ago, most Americans could view the public schools and the product of those schools with great pride. Some still can. But there is a growing number, especially in our cities, where it's been the case that the schools are in decline. Over the last 20 years, there's been no letdown in our desire for the best education possible for our children. Enrollment in this 20-year period has gone up 88%. Spending by us on education in constant dollars has increased 350%. We've tripled the number of employees, and by far the greatest increase in the public schools is now in non-teaching employees. If money alone could improve education, the skills and knowledge of the students should have reached dazzling heights by this time. And yet for 12 consecutive years, the test scores for college entrance exams has dropped, and last year reached an all-time low. With federal aid to education, there has come federal interference, and a case can be made that our educational problems have increased proportionately to that interference. Some years ago, when federal aid to higher education was first proposed, a number of college and university presidents journeyed to Washington. They were concerned that federal aid to education might turn out to be an invasion of academic freedom. And with that threatened, they went. They had evidence before they even went that already something had happened to academic freedom, because one of the university professors they asked to accompany them said he was heart and soul in agreement with them, but his own university was receiving so much in scientific grants from the federal government that he didn't dare go and express himself. They spoke to Francis Keppel, the director of education. They had a plan. They didn't just go to protest. They said, if you really want to help us, and we need help, there is no question of it. They said, why don't you allow, and they said, if our figure is wrong, you select the proper figure. But suppose, just for discussion, that you would allow any individual who wanted to give $100 to the educational institution of his choice in lieu of $100 of his income tax. If that figure is wrong, you change it. And for weeks, 2 weeks, they sat there and they debated and discussed. And finally they were reduced to simply asking, why won't a plan such as we've proposed, where the people themselves could deliver the aid based on their choice, why won't that system work? And finally, in frustration, Francis Keppel said, because don't you see, under such a plan, we wouldn't be able to achieve our social objectives. Well, now a number of schools are finding about those social objectives. I've spoken of some just a moment ago, humorously. But schools similar to this one that have not taken federal aid, Hillsdale College in Michigan, Brigham Young University in Salt Lake City, find now that the government, in frustration, wanting to control even those schools, has said, but if you have a student on your campus who is there on the GI Bill of Rights or on a federal grant or loan, that makes you subject to our rules and regulations. Thank heaven the schools are fighting back. Forced busing, of course, is a glaring and obvious example of interference by way of the courts. We see many more, including the invasion of what was once deemed the prerogative of the parents. Forced busing has not solved the problem which gave it birth, and it has instead created a bitterness and an anger in an area where great progress was being made. Recently in Florida, 2 teachers came to school wearing lapel buttons that said, I found it. The principal and the vice principal were curious as to what this meant, and they inquired, and the 2 informed them that the it they had found was God. They were horrified. And they said, what if a student asks her the question we just asked? If you answer them as you have us, you're injecting religion into education. Well, you wonder what the answer of a teacher would be if a child asked him what the words "In God We Trust" on the coin meant before he put it into the soft drink machine. We invoke God's help in taking the oath of office, even for the highest position in our land. We pledge allegiance to a nation under God. We celebrate Christmas in our public schools with evergreen and tinsel and colored lights. We can even sing Rudolph the Red-Nosed Reindeer. But don't let anyone mention the name of the man whose birthday we celebrate. On the Jefferson Memorial in Washington, D.C., it says, the God who gave us life gave us liberty. Can the liberties of a nation be secure when we have removed the conviction that those liberties are the gift of God? I remember one day hearing a man from South America. He was saying that he had become interested in why that these 2 great continents, both discovered virtually at the same time, both explored by educated people from the civilized states of Europe, both rich with natural resources, great expanses of land, why had North America developed in a way that South America couldn't match? And he said that he himself had come to the conclusion that it was because the men who went to South America went in search of gold, and those who came to North America came in search of God. But God has been expelled from the public schools on the grounds that he represents a threat to our constitutional separation of church and state. And yet there is no mention of education anywhere in the Constitution, probably because the Founding Fathers intended that it be left as much to parents and local communities as possible. Prior to the adoption of the Constitution in 1787, the Continental Congress expressed a belief that education was, of course, essential if the concept of government by the people were to be successful. But the Congress did not declare that it should be the concern of the national government. They did say, however, that education should recognize religion, morality, and knowledge as necessary to the happiness of mankind. Now, this doesn't mean that denominational religion should be taught in the public schools. But morality, sound ethical attitudes, and behavior were components of education until not long ago, and they should still be taught in the schools. The Ten Commandments, the Sermon on the Mount, and the Golden Rule are generally accepted as defining the highest form of human conduct, and those principles are common to all the great religions. Experience has taught us that living according to those principles leads to better conditions. Violating them leads to misery and unhappiness. And these principles have become the basis both of common law and of written law throughout the world. Is it any wonder that we're losing the means of telling right from wrong? What has been done in the public schools has not made them denominationally neutral. It has instead created in our children the impression that morality and religion have no place in everyday living. And a half an hour a week in Sunday school cannot compensate for several hours a day, 5 days a week in a public school. I have a letter from a mother. She wrote me from one of our large metropolitan centers in California. She called attention to the fact that in the period that sex education has been a part of the public school curriculum, venereal disease in that county has increased 866%. Sex education was instituted with the idea that no one's moral precepts or religious beliefs would be affronted. So it is taught with no reference to spirituality, no mention of morality or immorality. As one teacher self-righteously declared, it is taught as a purely physical process, like eating a ham sandwich when you're hungry. Is it any wonder, then, that teenagers accept it as no more significant than eating a sandwich when they're hungry? So some educators now are expressing wonderment and surprise that sexual problems are growing among students in the elementary level. The situational ethic is the thing today. That there is no hard and fast moral principle, that they're determined by the situation. We've all read the bumper sticker, if it feels good, do it. But sometimes it might feel good for someone to bop you over the head with a club. Is it strange now that we read that pilfering by employees in commercial concerns in America has become a $4 billion problem? In one eastern city in America, the American Civil Liberties Union has rushed to court to protest that the First Amendment is being violated because under pressure from the parents, they have removed a book from the school library. The book was called The Modern Day Mother Goose. Let me read you just one of the verses in that book that the Civil Liberties Union thinks should be still in the school library. Jack be nimble, Jack be quick, open the blade and give it a flick. Grab the purse, then just for kicks, just for fun, plunge the knife and cut and run. I'm sure any parent would be filled with pride to hear his child reciting that at the PTA meeting. I don't fault the intent of those who over the years have brought a great many of the changes to education. But a well-known road is paved with good intentions, and no one wants to go where it leads. We have to recognize that what has taken place did not take place entirely by chance. Many years ago, John D. Rockefeller put his assistant Fred Gates in charge of his tax-free General Education Board, forerunner of a foundation. In the first paper issued by the board, they said, "In our dreams we have limitless resources, and the people yield themselves with perfect docility to our molding hands. The present educational conventions fade from our minds, and unhampered by tradition, we work our own goodwill upon a grateful and responsive rural folk." Renee Wormser, the counsel for the House Committee on Tax-Exempt Foundations, has told how the foundations have nurtured some of the most ardent advocates of supplanting our system with the socialist state. He said, quote, "There is little doubt that the radical movement in education was accelerated by an organized socialist movement in the United States. Still, we say that far more of what has taken place is just the result of government's tendency to increase in size and power, and to behave as we all tend to behave when competition is eliminated and we have a monopoly. The National Education Association works ceaselessly to eliminate local control of education and even state supervision. Aided by state affiliates, NEA now sees itself as a powerful lobbying force whose goal is a national school system above parental interference with full control of the curriculum and the textbook subject matter. In their view, professionals should rear children, not amateurs who happen by biological accident to be parents. For too long time now, the independent colleges and universities, many of them church-supported, private and parochial elementary and secondary schools, have protected us against a total government monopoly of education. But inflationary erosion of the endowment income, increasing difficulty in raising tuition to keep pace with the rising costs, has brought a threat that public institutions with access to tax revenues can compete them out of existence. Few, if any, of the independent schools can match the luxury of the facilities and frills of public education. I doubt if any private school in the country has a per-student cost that is equal to its public counterpart. I remember when I was governor, and California, you're automatically on the Board of Trustees and the Board of Regents of the two state university systems. I journeyed up to one of our state universities up in the redwood trees, far up in the rural area. It had been predominantly a school for engineering and for the forestry sciences and agriculture and so forth. But the director of the new theater arts department was taking me through the facilities that had just been built by the taxpayers' money. And with great pride, he showed me their stage for stage presentations, hydraulic yet, up and down like the most modern of stages on Broadway. He showed me the TV studios and their radio station and so forth, filming facilities. And finally, I just couldn't help it. With my previous experience, I said, you know, if any of your graduates ever make it big on Broadway or in Hollywood or in television, they will never again perform in facilities that match the ones they've learned in. But never underestimate the people of America. A Frenchman 130 or 40 years ago, Alexis de Tocqueville, came across here. He was interested in what we had created in this country. And he went back to France and he told his fellow Frenchmen, he said, you won't believe this, but he said, in America, he said, if someone sees a problem, he doesn't go to government. He didn't then. He said he crosses the street and talks to a neighbor. And then they talk to some other neighbors. And pretty soon a committee is formed. And the first thing you know, the problem is solved and bureaucracy never had a hand in it at all. Well, what de Tocqueville described is the basis, the heritage of the independent and church-related colleges and universities in our land. Many years would pass when they started to fill that educational need before the land-grant colleges and the state universities would spread across this land. They were originally conceived, those public schools, as necessary to make higher education available to those who otherwise couldn't afford it. No one could quarrel with that purpose, and certainly no one suggests that they should be eliminated. But make no mistake about it, the threat of political control hangs over tax-supported institutions, and the greatest guarantee they have and we have of academic freedom in education in this land is the competition offered by independent and church-related schools such as Houston Baptist University. Today, I don't know how many of you are aware, we're seeing again that phenomenon that de Tocqueville spoke of almost a century and a half ago. The people have seen the need for another level of education, and someone has crossed the street and talked to his neighbor. Concerned by the humanist philosophy that is prevalent in elementary and secondary education in the public sector, the lack of moral teaching, and yes, the ban on prayer in schools. New, or perhaps I should say a very old educational concept has been revived. All over this land, schools, from first grade on through high school, called Christian, have come into being. some in residential dwellings, in church basements, in a variety of vacant buildings, wherever they can find a place. They're not affiliated with any particular church, as are the parochial schools. They have sprung from the grassroots, and they have only one thing in common: to restore to education the teaching of morality and ethics based on the rules that were laid down by the Prince of Peace. And they're increasing by some 225 to 50 each year all across the land. They accept students of all denominations without distinction as to creed or race. Now, in my view, this grassroots movement is one of the healthiest things that has happened to education in this century. The goal is not to eliminate or replace the public school, but to offer a free choice and thus bring the fresh wind of competition into the stale atmosphere of monopoly. I know that this imposes a burden on parents, a double burden. They must support a public system with their taxes and voluntarily support independent schools through tuition and contributions. The need for tax reform. We need a tax reform that will include tax credits for contributions and for at least a portion of the tuition. As for the cause that brings us here tonight, I know no single thing that any one of us can do in defense of freedom that is more important than supporting Houston Baptist University and independent education in the United States to ensure its continued existence. You know, in the field of education, I think the time is overdue that we should accept or adopt at the elementary and secondary level a policy that our public support of education actually should be directed to the individual child and not to the educational system. Yes, I'm speaking of a voucher system by which a student, given the voucher, could attend any school, public or private, of his choice, and that school then, upon his enrollment, would submit his voucher to the government or the proper government agency for payment. This would put competition in education, with students and parents making a decision as to which school offered the best educational buy for the money. Most important, it would give the people a chance to indicate how much they want education to reflect and perpetuate those principles and values which go to make up what we call civilization. Down through the centuries, for 6,000 years, men have kept a flame alive. Sometimes it's flickered and grown dim, but it has never been completely extinguished. By its light, we have learned that the things of greatest value are those for which men have always been willing to die. Today, a great portion of the world is in darkness. Sometimes it seems that we alone are tending the flame, and maybe that's our destiny. Maybe that's what we were meant to do. Off the coast of Massachusetts in 1630, John Winthrop stood on the tiny deck of the sloop Arbella, and he said to the little band of brave souls whose dream would one day become this nation, "We shall be as a city upon a hill. The eyes of all people are upon us, so that if we shall deal falsely with our God in this work we have undertaken, and so cause him to withdraw his present help from us, we shall be made a story and a byword throughout the world." The historian Toynbee has said history is the patter of silken slippers descending the stairs and the thunder of hobnail boots coming up. Well, our generation has had its experience with the hobnail boots. And once again in the world, the thunder of those boots is echoing throughout the world. We can let them trample into the dustbin, as they have the other great civilizations of the past, this nation. Or we can resist. We can stand on those things we believe in, and we can fulfill our destiny and build a shining city on a hill, an alabaster city, undimmed by human tears. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Governor Reagan, for your magnificent and memorable address.